just woke up in a fucking steaming mood, yeah? Because I live in a shithole! Do you know what I mean? Birmingham is a fucking shithole! I hate the fucking place! I fucking hate it!
If you were to ask your average World of Warcraft player what their least favorite zone to quest in back in the day was, Desolace would probably come up almost immediately, and for good reason. On a purely mechanical level, it's never been a great leveling experience. That was true in the original version, and it's still mostly true after Cataclysm. The revamp fixed some of the bigger issues, sure, but even then most players would still rather skip it entirely. In current retail, it, like most of the other original zones, is effectively obsolete unless you go out of your way to quest there. Which, regardless of how you feel about it, is a bit of a shame, but also something that's pretty difficult to avoid. Especially in a franchise that's been running for so long. This isn't one of those videos where I'm going to tell you Desolace is secretly amazing and everyone else just doesn't get it. There's a reason why people have spent years arguing over whether the original zone was rushed or just kind of abandoned halfway through development. Despite all of that, I kind of love it. In fact, it's probably my favorite of the original vanilla zones, for reasons that are almost entirely subjective, granted, but still. And that's really what this video is about, not whether Desolace is good or bad, but why it stuck with me for all these years. I think a lot of that comes down to how I first got introduced to the zone. If you played Horde, the transition isn't quite as dramatic, but as a Night Elf player, which I was, walking into Desolace for the first time was pretty jarring. You go from the vibrant greens and purples of Darkshore and Ashenvale into this grey, hostile stretch of land that feels dead in a way no other zone quite replicates. It's like whatever went wrong here happened long before you ever set foot there, and I mean, that's not far from the truth. If you don't know the story, 1,000 years ago, Desolace used to be a fertile grassland. In fact, Tauren shamans would often go there to try and communicate with the Earth Mother. After years of trying to wake her up, they instead summoned a giant earth elemental called Terradras, who then proceeded to drain all the life from the land around her, turning it into what it is today. Overall, this idea of the land being drained rather than destroyed or corrupted comes across really well, I feel. Even in places where there's some greenery left, the overall bleak color palette still makes everything look kind of unhealthy and sickly in a way. This might be a bit of a stretch, but when you combine that with the scattered bones, the brown stagnant pools of water, and those towering ruins in the background, the whole place oddly reminds me of a Beksinski painting. Not any specific one, just the overall dreary, almost dreamlike aesthetic of it all, but that's just me, I don't know. You've seen it also being compared to Morrowind from the Elder Scrolls series, and I can sorta see that as well, although maybe not quite as alien looking. To sort of illustrate some of the environmental storytelling that fascinates me, we should talk about the centerpiece of the zone, the Kodo Graveyard, and what would eventually become the Cenarian Wildlands. What strikes me as really poignant is that, as far as I remember, there is no quest that directly leads you there. You kind of just stumble on this ravine filled with giant Kodo bones without any real context behind it. I remember there being a quest to collect some of them, but it was given by this random orc guy just off to the side. But even then, I don't remember there being a lot of backstory given. For it being such a defining landmark of the zone, there's surprisingly little to do here. And in an odd way, I kind of appreciate that, since you're never told how you're meant to feel about it. The lore never outright spells it out, but it's pretty widely accepted that old Kodo come here to die, clearly inspired by the real-world idea of elephant graveyards. After the Cataclysm, this whole place obviously becomes part of the Cenarian Wildlands. Basically, the area just got flooded and revitalized, and the Cenarian Circle just kind of settled there, I guess. Overall, I'm pretty conflicted if I prefer the old version or not. On one hand, it does detract from the desolation, for lack of a better word, but on the other, this contrast between the giant grove and the surrounding wasteland is kind of neat. If I had to choose one, I think I'd sacrifice the convenience of another central quest hub for the original's ambience, but there's also probably a good deal of nostalgia talking there as well. You can't really avoid that. Speaking of, another example of environmental storytelling that I feel Blizzard doesn't do nearly as well these days are those giant Naga skeletons in the Valley of Bones. And what I mean by that is that they rarely add landmarks like that to the game anymore without the need to explain what they are and why they're there. Don't get me wrong, there's still plenty of unanswered questions in modern WoW, but they feel a lot more cosmic and meta in a sense. I think the shift in design is that the world itself isn't treated as the main character anymore. The player is, along with a handful of other important NPCs. And while that approach has its narrative strengths naturally, it does mean we lose moments like this. Places that exist purely to make you stop, look around and wonder what happened here. But that's a whole separate tangent I might save for another video if I can stomach listening to my own voice for extended periods of time again. Moving on to talking about the zone's original layout, whether intentional or not, the way it transitions from mildly bad to worse is oddly satisfying from a design perspective, especially as an Alliance player starting at Nigel's point. You move on from these small pockets of life into the central stretches of the zone, which are basically just a dead wasteland. Then, further south, you hit Manarak Coven, which, if things weren't depressing enough already, is also infested with demons. The revamped version strips some of that overall sense of dread. In addition to all the changes to the terrain itself, the draw distance is noticeably improved, which removes a lot of that choking bleakness and oppressive atmosphere the zone is known for. I'd even argue Desolace originally felt more hostile than places that were meant to be overtly dangerous, like say Plaguelands or Silitus. And I think when I say that, a lot of the players who quested there back in the day, or even now when Classic, can sort of, on an intrinsic level, understand what I mean. Now I'm going to attempt to tell you all the story that actually inspired me to make this video. The first time I played World of Warcraft, I was with my best friend. He played the Night Elf Hunter and I was a druid. We'd been questing in Desolace for a few days now. At that point we were just going through the motions and trying to move on as quickly as possible. Then out of nowhere he just stopped. I asked what was wrong and he just said that he was done. Done with this ugly grey zone, done with the quests that send you running across the entire map, done with the awful mob density, all of that. He even said that just being there made him feel sick. At the time, I didn't know the game well enough to realize we had other options. I didn't know we could just go to Stranglethorn or Arati. So I told him it sucked, but we had to push through. In response, he abandoned all our quests and just started walking towards Feralas. I told him we were way too low level, but he didn't care. He just wanted to be anywhere else other than Desolace. And I gotta tell you, when we finally crossed into Feralas, when that wall of green hit us, the relief I felt is something I still vividly remember. I remember my friend stopping, looking back at me and just saying in our native language, "Damn, that's pretty." Of course, we got destroyed immediately after, but at least now we knew that there was light at the end of the tunnel. He'd never really acknowledged any of the environments we'd been in before that. He wasn't a stop and smell the roses kind of player, if you know what I mean. But Desolace made him miserable enough that it forced him to notice the contrast. It forced him to acknowledge this virtual world we both occupied for more than just its mechanics. I sort of lied at the start. Desolace isn't my favorite zone, at least not in the traditional sense. But it's so uniquely bleak, so unapologetically miserable that it acts as a kind of palate cleanser. It makes the beauty of Azeroth hit harder because of how depressing it is. Whether intentional or not, in the context of where it sits in the world, Desolace does something very few modern zones ever manage to do. For better or for worse, it made us feel something. It's a relic of bygone Warcraft, when convenience wasn't the be-all and end-all, when the world wasn't just set dressing and actually forced players to get immersed in it, whether they wanted to or not. Anyway, thanks for watching. Bye!